Good morning, and welcome to session 7 of OPWB's Source Water Protection webinar series, Protecting Ecosystems to Improve the Health of Watersheds and Aquifers. I'd like to start out by acknowledging that I'm hosting this webinar on the traditional unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan people. I'd like you to take a moment and think about and acknowledge the traditional territories you are joining from. Thanks. And on that note, I just wanted to say, from my perspective, I believe water provides opportunities for reconciliation. Local governments and water suppliers, many who are the audience for this webinar series, can play an important role in building positive relationships and partnerships with Indigenous communities, centering around water protection. And source protection planning processes are truly strengthened if you can include Indigenous values, knowledge, and leadership right from the beginning of the process. So today, as we have done in previous weeks, we'll start with a quick introduction from me. And then we have 3 panelists today, one from an Ontario Conservation Authority, a local government from Vancouver Island, and a Kootenay-based conservation organization. So it should be an interesting session. Then we'll end with some Q&A. Few housekeeping items. Don't forget that all of these webinars are recorded and posted on the Source Water Protection Toolkit website. And if you are a member of PIBC or EOCP, you can get training credits for attending these webinars. And I'd like to invite you to enter any questions that you have anytime during the webinar using the Q&A feature, not the chat, because the chat pops up and it's a bit disruptive, but feel free to use the Q&A throughout the webinar. Big thank you to all of the people who have been involved in writing the toolkit and putting these webinar series together. So as mentioned before, we had this super stellar technical advisory committee of over 45 people that met frequently over the last couple of years to talk about toolkit content, but also just to talk about source protection issues in general and what can be done to improve source protection in the Okanagan, but also beyond. Funding was provided by the Ministry of Municipal Affairs, Interior Health Authority, City of Kelowna, City of West Kelowna, and the OPWB, and most recently through the Healthy Watersheds Initiative. And thanks to Heather Lorette and her team at Lorette Aquatic Consulting for authoring the toolkit. And to Casey Moran for helping coordinate the webinars. Thanks, everybody. So next week, we've got a great webinar on mapping. And so we've got 3 speakers that will talk about how to access and use publicly available geospatial data for source water protection, and a couple of researchers in government and academia who are actually using mapping to understand risks to source waters at multiple spatial scales. So that should be an interesting session next week. And then after that, we've only got 2 more webinars left. So December 15th, monitoring and reporting for source water protection with Heather Lorette and Paige from Living Lakes, Canada. And then the additional webinar that we're putting on in January. And so I'm still working on confirming speakers for that, but the registration link should come soon. So here's the toolkit. And the toolkit is available as a download, a PDF download, but it's also been fully transferred to a website. So sourcewaterprotectiontoolkit.ca. So everything you see here in the toolkit is on that website. Part 1 is designed to clarify and simplify the source protection planning process. So the water assessments and protection plans that water suppliers must do. Part 2 is the tools, and these webinar series are focused on those tools. And then part 3 of the toolkit has a whole bunch of additional info and resources, diving deeper into the information in part 1 and part 2. So here is part 1, the roadmap to source water protection. So like I said, it really simplifies and clarifies that protection planning process and talks about how that relates to the tools or the actions in the toolkit. And then that shows on the right-hand side the different webinar sessions that are dedicated to each tool. So today we're talking about tool 5, natural assets and green infrastructure. So within the toolkit, we focus on a 5-step process that's adapted from the Municipal Natural Assets Institute. Oh, I probably got that wrong, but MNAI. So we talk about that process and what it means in a source water protection lens. but we really focus on the benefits of natural assets and green infrastructure. The benefits outside of just protecting drinking water quality. And there are multiple benefits. And I'm sure you'll hear about those today from our panelists. So our panelists. So first we have Kris. So Kris is the Senior Manager of Water and Wastewater Services for the Comox Valley Regional District on Vancouver Island. He leads a team of 30 staff to manage water from the upper reaches of the Comox Lake Watershed to the ocean outfall, which is 3 kilometers out into the Salish Sea. Then following Kris, we have Kendra. Kendra Norwood is the Conservation Program Director at the West Kootenay EcoSociety, and she's in charge of coordinating their Community in Nature project. And then Don will be speaking last. He's the practice leader for hydrogeology and the technical lead for drinking water source protection work at the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. So I'd like to welcome the panelists, and I'd like to welcome Kris, or invite Kris to share his screen, please.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Just bear with me. All good?
Looks good, Kris.
Okay, great. Yeah, good morning again, everyone. I'm happy to be here with you this morning to talk to you about the CVRD and our partners' experience with the Municipal Natural Asset Initiative project to date, and why we embarked upon it and where we are in the process. But first, I'd like to acknowledge that I work and live in the unceded traditional territory of the Comox First Nation, and who are the traditional keepers of this land, which includes the full Comox Lake Watershed, which I'll be discussing today. So to start with, I thought I'd provide some brief context for those of you that aren't familiar with our part of the island. So the CVRD, Comox Valley Regional District, stretches from the Salish Sea on the east, including Denman and Hornby Island, to the Beaufort Mountains and Strathcona Park. Covers about 1,700 square kilometers, includes 3 member municipalities and 3 electoral areas with a total population of about 70,000. So of that 1,700 square kilometers in our region, about 460 of that, so about between a quarter and a third, fall within the Comox Lake Watershed, which captures the rainwater that's used by the Comox Valley water system. So the Comox Valley water system provides bulk water supply, treatment, transmission, and storage for the two of the municipalities, Courtenay and Comox, and then several CVRD local service areas that are in the rural areas around that central urban core of the valley. So the municipalities have their own distribution systems, and then the CVRD manages the distribution systems for the local service area. So there's about 50,000 residents that participate in the regional service through a combination of the municipal and rural areas. The Village of Cumberland have their own water supply, which I'll touch on a later slide. Sorry, I just skipped a slide there. So the Comox Valley water system provides, second. So the sole source of the water for the Comox Valley water system is the Comox Lake Watershed. Until recently, the CVRD relied heavily on BC hydro infrastructure to extract and deliver water into the regional transmission system. However, we just completed a $120 million project that includes a new intake from the lake, a water filtration plant, and then the conveyance necessary to connect that infrastructure to our existing system. And that has provided independence from BC Hydro's conveyance infrastructure and helps us ensure water supply during both extreme rain events that like the ones we've seen lately, and also during years of extreme drought, which are becoming more and more common here on the east coast of Vancouver Island. So due to the legacy of the ENN land grant, through which the BC government at the time gave Lord Dunsmuir kind of the southeast quadrant of Vancouver Island in exchange for building a railway from Victoria up to the Campbell River area. Approximately 2/3 of our watershed is owned by private timber companies, and most of the remaining third is provincial parkland. So there's effectively no crown land in the watershed, which is just one of the unique characteristics of our local watershed. As such, the CVRD has little direct control over what takes place in the majority of the watershed. And this means that all watershed management initiatives require a multi-stakeholder approach with participation from landowners, jurisdictional authorities, recreational users, stewardship groups, and of course the Comox First Nation. So given the multi-ownership, multi-governance nature of the watershed, when we were directed by the Ministry of Health in 2015 to develop a watershed protection plan, the CVRD convened a watershed advisory group to help guide development of the plan. There are approximately 25 members, including representation from environmental stewardship groups, recreational associations, elected officials, local government staff, the landowners themselves. And initially, the WAG was, as affectionately called, the WAG was developed to guide development of the plan, but has now evolved into implementation to help guide implementation as well. So we're now in year 5 of Watershed Protection Plan implementation, and I'm very happy to report that the engagement of those participants remains really high. And with their support and guidance, the CVRD has made some significant progress in all of the key recommendations since the plan was received in 2016. So one of the key current initiatives that falls under the umbrella of our Watershed Protection Plan implementation is our collaboration with the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, or MNAI. So local governments are pretty good at managing, or getting better and better at managing hard infrastructure like roads, pipes, sewers, libraries, buses. But we've traditionally been, we've traditionally ignored the significant values that are provided by natural infrastructure. And the CVRD is no different. The MNAI teams up with communities to evaluate nature's role in providing the core services, to help develop resilient long-term infrastructure alternatives that at substantial savings to what would otherwise be required from an engineered asset, and incorporating this information into a mainstream asset management system. So we're well underway with an asset management system for all of our engineered assets. And we see this initiative with MNAI as just a fully complementary part of that engineered asset management plan. And so that is the main thrust of this work. So in 2018, when we heard about this opportunity with MNAI, we jumped at the opportunity to get that support and working towards an asset management approach to managing specifically the Comox Lake watershed. As I mentioned, the Comox Lake watershed is the sole source of drinking water for about 50,000 people. Our climate modeling indicates that that we could expect water quality to decrease, so turbidity to go up through these extreme rain events, and then quantity to decrease in the summer, given the predicted longer, drier summers. So developing a methodology for evaluating the watershed will hopefully allow us to continue to dedicate the appropriate resources to improve the resilience of this natural asset to the coming changes. And so we see collaboration with MNAI as being the first step. So the CVRD, Kootenay, Comox, Cumberland, and the KFN work together to develop a project proposal, and finally an MOU with MNAI. A working group of similar membership to the Watershed Advisory Group was convened to help define the scope of the initiative, and again, throughout the process to help guide it. The process has strong support and representation from our local environmental stewardship sector, who have been leaders in recognizing and promoting the importance of quantifying the value of our key national assets. And so this photo shows one of the first group meetings, pre-COVID, of course, in the Comox First Nations stunning boardroom overlooking the Comox estuary. So at a very high level, so I am conscious of time, the approach taken has been fourfold. So first, developing an inventory of natural assets, showing where the assets are, what the assets are and where they are, coding the assets using standard asset management nomenclature. Typical categories include riparian wetlands, the glacier, forests, and soils. Next, undertaking a condition assessment of those assets. The inventory, we're working towards potentially representing, these through an online dashboard and can be expanded and deepened over time as more and new data becomes available. And then modeling scenarios to understand how those assets are likely to be impacted by future changes. So using existing water quality and climate data to understand the likely effects of climate change on water quality and quantity. Identifying and modeling scenarios including that that address or incorporate wildfires, climate-driven changes in vegetation and forestry activity. And next, and arguably most important elements of the work is understanding and articulating the areas of overlap of the benefits and uses of the watershed to each of the key stakeholders. So we think that having a good understanding of where the interests of the Comox Valley water system align with those of other stakeholders is critical to the effective collaboration of this group in the future to achieve common goals. And the flip side is important as well. Having a common understanding of where the various interests and activities of other stakeholders conflict with ours is equally important to that process. So the village of Cumberland's water supply, so I mentioned I'd come back to them. So it's supplied from a series of reservoirs within the Perseverance watershed, which is one of the sub-watersheds of our broader Comox Lake. The system supplies drinking water to about 3,700 people in the village. So to date, the system has met the requirements for filtration deferral due to the low levels of turbidity and a watershed control program that minimizes the potential for contamination. So the naturally kind of high quality of water in this system currently provides a significant cost savings to the village by avoiding the need for a costly filtration plant, such as the one that we've just completed for ourselves. So the ability of that watershed to continue to provide clean water provides significant value to the village. However, a recent study completed by Tetra Tech concluded that 97% of the turbidity that's drawn into the lake from our drinking water intake comes from Perseverance Creek, despite it not being the largest tributary of the lake. Largely because it's closest, it injects the most sediment and has the finest sediment as well. So given the size and complexity of the entire Comox Lake watershed and the disproportionate impact of the Perseverance Creek watershed on drinking water quality, partway through the M&I process, the team decided to reduce the scope of the project to focus on this sub-watershed. We've now developed an updated report outline, assigned responsibilities, and we're working toward the draft report in early 2022. The intention of this process and the report is to act as a template for expansion of that methodology to the other sub-basins and eventually the entire watershed. And if successful, the model is likely to be applied to our other drinking watersheds in the Comox Valley. So second to last slide. So just very briefly, some of the lessons learned so far that, as I just touched on, it's important to not be too ambitious, particularly for the first foray into this type of work. So we've learned that lesson. We've reduced the scope to a more manageable size, and then we plan to expand that in the future. The importance of having a detailed outline of the kind of the desired outcome at the front end. Have everybody agree on that before spending a lot of work and time, just to be sure you know where you want to get to is really important up front. Make sure that all of the key stakeholders are at the table and bought into the process. That's not always easy, but it's worth the effort. Be sure to build on and incorporate all of the other work that's been done in the similar area. So you're building on that work and not duplicating anything. And then just plan on it taking time and it being a live document, that it doesn't have to be perfect. Part of our objective is to articulate where the gaps are, and that falls in, that part and parcel with the recommendations about what future work can be done to strengthen the process and flesh it out. And I'll close with a screenshot from the Cryosphere project, which is a provincial initiative, but has a local presence in our valley, just showing the significant losses to the Comox Glacier year over year. That red heat map is showing some very significant losses to this key natural asset, which unfortunately is projected to largely disappear by the end of the century. It's a project underway in partnership with the VIU and UNBC. It involves LiDAR and ground truthing to monitor the depth of the snow and ice throughout the year, tracking changes and gaining a much better understanding of how the region will respond to the local impacts of climate change. In addition to being an iconic view for downtown, it's also provides about 25% of our base flows to the Comox Lake in the summertime. And as I said, projections show it disappearing by the end of the century. So the MNAI project and the effort to quantify the value of the Comox Lake watershed and shared protection will help us take the necessary steps to track and prepare for this change and others that may be coming. So thanks for your time this morning.
Thank you very much, Kris. Great presentation. I'd like to invite Kendra now to share her screen next.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining in. Let's get my screen going here. All right, how does that look?
Looks good, Kendra.
Okay, great. So today I'm joining this meeting from the unsurrendered and stolen lands of the Sinixt peoples. I acknowledge that colonization has had and continues to have destructive and devastating impacts on the recognition, rights, and autonomy of the hereditary Indigenous caretakers of this land that we currently live and work on. Indigenous people have never surrendered their rights, and as a result, we pledge to work with the First Peoples on true reconciliation with the earth and with each other. If you're not familiar with the West Kootenay EcoSociety, we're a nonprofit, community-driven organization that brings together local residents to protect natural environments while building just, equitable, healthy, and livable communities in the West Kootenay region. So my name is Kendra Norwood, and I'm the Conservation Program Director and in charge of coordinating the Community and Nature Project, which I'm very excited to tell you more about today. So let me start by sharing the need for this work as it was brought forward to us by the communities which we're working with. Current understanding of climate change in the Kootenays predicts more extreme weather events, and projections include less snow accumulation, faster snow melt, increased peak flows, longer dry spells, and higher winds. These all impact water quality, quantity, and timing of flow. However, we also understand that intact watersheds protect us through conserving water in many ways, including moderating snowpack and runoff, reducing the impacts of intense storms and droughts, and managing soil erosion. So intact natural watersheds help maintain the quality, quantity, and timing of flow of water. We know that we need to take precautionary measures now to protect our watersheds, to drastically improve their ability to support our needs, especially when considering present and future impacts of climate change. So in December of 2018, members from several communities that surround the city of Nelson, who were worried about logging in the watersheds that they rely on for drinking water, met with the goal to determine what was needed to protect them. The meeting was hosted by Area E Director Ramona Fost and attended by almost 30 people. So presentations from local professional experts covered hydrology, climate change, issues with current watershed governance, policy and legislation, and the potential of using nature-based planning as a way to address all of these factors to protect these watersheds. So nature-based planning is an organized process in which communities and professionals work together to develop sustainable protection and use of land, fresh water, and oceans. Nature-based planning provides a picture of the ecological framework that is necessary to protect and the ecological limits within which human uses need to be carried out in order to be sustainable to protect water. And again, this planning must act in a precautionary way to consider the uncertainties of climate change. So from the meeting in 2018, a few of the scientific experts and community members from different at-risk watersheds began to meet regularly to bring this idea of nature-based planning forward. In 2020, the West Kootenay EcoSociety was asked to apply for funding to manage a project to begin laying the groundwork for nature-based plans in these watersheds. And we acquired funding through the Healthy Watersheds Initiative. And so this map shows shows the 7 watersheds that we're working in today. And right here is Nelson, just to give you your bearings there. So it's important to note here that at this time, in order to actually protect watersheds, legislation that puts healthy watershed values at the forefront needs to be implemented. So our vision is to have legislation based on nature-based plans and used in local land use planning and bylaws to ensure people are resilient to the worst effects of climate change and can maintain their drinking water sources. So we think that our project can be used as a pilot for other communities across BC. The current provincial government has committed to work towards a paradigm shift in forestry practices, which ideally will help protect healthy watershed ecosystems. There is a general understanding that healthy, intact watersheds support resilient communities, but how do we get there? Until legislation changes to prioritize the protection of drinking water and the healthy ecosystem function of watersheds, water users are left with all of the risks associated with development in their watersheds and all of the responsibility to deal with associated costs and danger from wildfire, flooding, and landslides. So until legislation and regulation is in place, we're supporting communities to advocate for themselves. We're building in-depth community understanding of the ecological condition and function of watersheds in which they live, and building capacity to bring this knowledge forwards for meaningful dialogue with other users of the watersheds, such as commercial developers or industry, when those entities put forward their intended land use plans. Our Community in Nature project is laying the foundation for best practices backed up by the most recent science of what healthy, intact watersheds supporting resilient communities could look like across the province. The long-term overall goal of this project is to protect and restore the natural water quality, quantity, and timing of flow for 7 watersheds through the implementation of nature-based plans that give the priority to the protection of ecosystems through precautionary analysis, decision-making, and governance. So embedded within this long-term goal is the necessity to work with communities, including Indigenous communities, to incorporate their values and knowledge into the planning process. So this year we're in phase 1, which is largely focused on the creating the scientific foundation for nature-based plans in 2 of the 7 watersheds and introducing this initial work to the communities. In the second phase, we'll see these 2 preliminary plans completed And we'll use these as pilots to complete the preliminary plans for the remaining 5 watersheds. And then in the third phase, we'll see the remaining 5 nature-based plans completed and a watershed governance system working in the area. So this year, we're creating a map set with interpretations describing what a land use plan prioritizing water quality, quantity, and timing of flow looks like, with the added layers of biodiversity protection and climate change, and what needs to be considered for resilience. The overall map set will represent a network of ecological reserves designed for these values. So this here is an example of a local nature-based plan that is currently functioning as a community forest. This plan was created in the mid-90s and is a great example of the longevity of science-based community planning for natural ecosystem resilience. I know there's a lot to look at there, and I'm happy to go back to that slide later on. So in parallel with the scientific research going on into nature-based plans, we're supporting community members to become familiar with the process and benefits. We're conducting preliminary research to determine what the communities value about their watersheds and if or how they think their watershed land base should be managed. We need to determine if a nature-based plan is feasible in each community, and the community needs to be on board. This is a slow process and involves engaging hundreds of community members. And we're doing this by regularly meeting with key members in each community who've been working on this since 2018 to support their own efforts to bring this idea forward and build buy-in. And those are a few of the questions in a recent survey that went out. And again, I'm happy to share that as well. So along with this work is introducing the role watershed governance can play and creating a governance plan. This year, we're focusing on researching key recommendations for next steps and initial meetings with key community members. The hope is that this will be the first step in establishing a more formal structure of collaboration for those engaged in these watersheds. For this work, we're drawing on insight from existing successful examples of groups across the province, many of which are probably here today. These examples show the many benefits of creating an organized group structure and illustrate the different challenges communities face in this work. Being an organized group can add legitimacy to a watershed community's work. And it can open up more opportunities for funding, which is huge. Strengthening their position for meaningful dialogue with other groups, including the provincial government and industry, and added validity when bringing forward policy recommendations to decision makers. So each of the 7 communities that we're working with have both similar and very different needs. And we're just in the beginning phases of discussing what watershed governance could look like in each community and as a single united group. So we're meeting with the Regional District of Central Kootenay's Watershed Governance Initiative Project team, where there is a great opportunity for our learnings and processes to inform their initiative on a regional scale. And we're just beginning this work, and we're at the critical stage of searching for more funding to be able to continue. So I invite you to follow along with us by going to our website, and in the spring, we'll be releasing our preliminary nature-based plans, as well as a playbook and a toolkit for communities to use to guide their own similar work. And I can put the link to our website in the chat, as well as my email, and feel free to reach out to me with any questions. And thank you so much for listening. I hope that I've inspired some ideas and piqued some interest in our project. Thank you. Definitely. Thank you very much, Kendra. And I'm excited to hear that you're putting together a toolkit as well. So I'll keep in touch. Absolutely. Great. Thank you.
And last, we have Dawn. Go ahead and share your screen, Dawn.
There we go. I have to remember to share it before I start the presentation.
Looks good.
Okay, thank you. First of all, oops, sorry, some of my notes are being covered by the peoples. All right. Anyway, I have my notes screen, but I can't see it. If you can bear with me.
Yeah, can you move us over to your other monitor?
Here, I'll move it over to here. Sorry about that.
No problem.
My apologies. First of all, Toronto and Region Conservation Authority recognizes and acknowledges that our work is undertaken within the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the Williams Treaty Nations, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis Nations. As stewards of land and water resources within the Greater Toronto Area, TRCA appreciates and recognizes the history and diversity of the land, as well as our shared values and interests, and is respectful of working in this territory. And thank you to the Okanagan Basin Water Board for the opportunity to provide a Conservation Authority perspective on the protection of our regional groundwater resources on a watershed basis. Today in this presentation, I'll be talking about a mix of ecology, engineering, and geoscience, as well as science communication. I believe that all three are key to the sustainable protection of our regional groundwater resources. First of all, I'll provide some information about conservation authorities, since we are unique to Ontario and many people on this webinar may not know of our existence even. Then I want to get a bit more specific about the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority, who we are and what we do. And then I'll dive a little more deeply into the work we do to protect regional groundwater resources, including source water protection planning and watershed planning. Last but certainly not least, I want to cover how we maintain our data and share our knowledge with others. At the end of the presentation, I'll summarize some of the key thoughts and provide some insights into potential next steps. First of all, TRCA is one of 36 conservation authorities in Ontario. We were created back in 1946 by legislation known as the Conservation Authorities Act, and our mandate was to, and still is, to safeguard and enhance the health and well-being of our watershed communities through the protection and restoration of the natural environment. And we recognize the ecological services that the environment provides. Then specifically for Toronto and Region Conservation Authority, we've been in existence as an entity since 1957, and we resulted in the merger of 4 different local conservation authorities that decided to pool their resources after Hurricane Hazel to allow more comprehensive solutions to some of the flooding issues. Our vast jurisdiction of 2,500 square kilometers includes 9 separate watersheds, plus some Lake Ontario waterfront shoreline. Sorry, forgot to mute my phone. And we have one of the most densely populated jurisdictions in all of Canada, with almost 5 million people in 15 individual municipalities. This image that you see now was taken last year during the pandemic, and to me it symbolizes a lot of TRCA's vision to me. This is a redneck grebe. It was once rare in our jurisdiction, But now we have many pairs of these birds along our waterfront. And the fact that they are able to raise young successfully in waters that were once considered too polluted to support a healthy fish population speaks to how far we have come. And in terms of flourishing together nature and community, you see the reflection here of a cyclist riding by just behind this rather uncommon shorebird that has called our waterfront home. The key words for me in our mission statement are the words resilient, science, and education. As a science-based decision maker, we rely on the work of engineers, ecologists, geoscientists, and others to inform all of our projects and our permitting processes. But we cannot forget education. It is said that people only care about that which they understand, and that they will only understand that which they are taught. Lastly, without collaboration and engagement with all our stakeholders, successful outcomes would not be possible. For me, hydrogeology lies at the intersection of geotechnical engineering, ecology, and surface water hydrology. Groundwater soil and soils are significant components of both slope failure and erosion processes. Groundwater also sustains both terrestrial and aquatic ecosystem. In turn, these communities stabilize slopes and help prevent erosion. And in addition, they also help facilitate infiltration, which then helps sustain our groundwater resources. Low impact development is one way of retaining runoff from impervious surfaces. And many of these techniques, many of these techniques also enhance recharge. And in addition, many of the techniques such as rain gardens, bioretention swales, Silva cells, etc., also are encouraging a flourishing natural ecological system to protect the recharge to the groundwater system. So a little bit about drinking water source protection. Here in Ontario, drinking water protection was formalized in 2006 with the Clean Water Act. And this legislation resulted from the Walkerton tragedy of 2000, which resulted in more than 2,000 residents becoming sick, and 6 people actually lost their life. This tragedy resulted in an inquiry headed by Justice O'Connor and recognized the importance of watershed-based protection for our drinking water supplies, both surface water and groundwater. And this source protection process recognizes that both science and policy have to come together here to ensure the long-term sustainability of our potable water resources. The science is represented by our assessment reports, and the policies are included in our source protection plans. And these were approved for pretty well all of Ontario by 2015. We're currently in the process of updating these assessment reports and plans as part of an ongoing continuous improvement process. To give you a little bit of snapshot of where I call home and where my work focuses. Many people think that the GTA relies solely on Lake Ontario for drinking water supplies, but as you can see from the various wellhead capture zones across particularly the north and the western part of the region, there are a lot of groundwater-based supplies that service many communities. These include places like Orangeville, Halton Hills, King Township, Aurora, Witchard, Stouffville, and Uxbridge. amongst others. And in terms of natural assets, the blue shading here represents the Paris moraine, and the purple shading represents the Oak Ridges moraine. These two moraines represent a significant set of aquifer systems, not just the Oak Ridges aquifers as it's known, but others that lie beneath. And both of these features are key to the municipal water supplies of our region. Across the GTA, both bedrock and overburden aquifers exist, but as it happens, bedrock aquifers are fairly limited in the TRCA jurisdiction to an area in the kind of the northwest corner, shown in purple in this little inset diagram. Our three main aquifers, the Oak Ridges, Thorncliffe, and Scarborough aquifers, are all used by our municipal partners to supply groundwater to residents in our communities. Some of these aquifers are shallower than others and have higher recharge, but they're also more susceptible to contamination from human activities. And looking at it from a geographic perspective here, you see the dark blue that represents very thick overburden sediments where we have bedrock valleys and significant groundwater resources. And you also see areas in yellow and green that represent areas where the sediment is, or sediments are actually very thin or absent. And what this highlights to me is I'll call it the disparity of groundwater resources, that it's not just a matter of sinking another well to alleviate a supply problem or a contamination issue. We are really restricted, and some areas have a lot more resources than others. Some of the actions that we undertake involve the acquisition of environmentally sensitive land and retaining them in public ownership. We also operate a network of parks for recreational opportunities to get people outdoors, and which has been especially important through this pandemic. And I think back to my comment about people understanding what they are taught about, these parks give us an excellent educational opportunity to explain the importance of our natural resources and ecosystems. We also work with a variety of organizations for the restoration of impacted ecosystems through a wide range of activities such as tree planting, wetland creation, low impact development, stream rehabilitation, stream bank protection. But we also get involved in actual monitoring and modeling. So here we have an image of a contractor installing a monitoring well in one of our watersheds. And on the right-hand side, we have the results of some of the modeling work done in our jurisdiction, in this case for the Humber watershed plan. And you can see again, not only is there a disparity of watershed resources from the previous slides, but also a great disparity in terms of where recharge occurs. The higher zones being in red here and very low zones being in the light and dark blue. But all this science and knowledge doesn't do a lot of good unless we find ways of sharing it. We can have the most comprehensive data sets in the world, but without open data and public use and access to our data, a lot of the value would be lost. So we've been working at sharing through a wide variety of methodologies on both hard copy for old school people like me, but also through innovative techniques such as story maps. And I provided a link here to one of them that's on our website. We also provide presentations at conferences. We have watershed advisory committees that we have established to focus on certain watersheds and watershed areas. Sometimes we combine watersheds into single committees. And we hold consultation sessions with members of the public, especially considering some of the work we do around modeling of floodplains, where we may cause an impact to people's property value when they find out, surprise, surprise, they're actually in a floodplain. And then, of course, we have social media posts as well. Another way, specifically regarding hydrogeologic data and hydrologic data, we help support the Oak Ridges Marine Groundwater Program, which is a consortium of over a dozen partner agencies, including 4 regional municipalities and the City of Toronto. And we compile all our efforts and have established a database that currently stores over 132 million water level readings, almost 29 million precipitation readings, 5 million streamflow records, and over 500,000 borehole records. So this information is used by all of our partners and is available to the consulting community as well on a subscription basis to ensure that we're all working from a common science basis. So in summary, I would agree with the previous presenters that natural solutions are really the most sustainable in the long run, that we need to find this systems approach, that we can't just say, oh, this is a groundwater issue or this is a surface water issue. It really takes input from all the scientific disciplines to ensure the long-term sustainability of our water resources. And really, when it comes down to it, if we protect all the aspects of our overall ecosystems at the ground surface, we'll also have healthier aquifers at the end of the day. I do, however, believe that ongoing restoration and monitoring are key to the ongoing success and sustainability of our groundwater resources. Without these two, we won't really know what works and what doesn't. And I think we've learned a lot on the surface water side over the years. And now it's time to apply some of that monitoring and restoration knowledge to our groundwater resources. And with that, I'll end, and thank you for your time this morning, and sorry about my glitch at the beginning.
No problem, John.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Great. So now I invite the panelists to turn your cameras back on for the Q&A. If you're there, Kris, there you are. Great. I am going to repost a link from Kendra, because Kendra, you accidentally just sent it to the hosts and panelists. So now I've sent it to everybody. The link to the Community and Nature website on the EcoSociety website and Kendra's contact information. So that's in the chat. I do have one question in the Q&A specifically for Kris. And Ivor's wondering, do you have a rough budget for the first phase of the NAM project you have undertaken?
I believe so. The project was funded through a combination of grant funding, and which is the lion's share, and that was kind of what initiated the initiative. So MNAI obtained that grant funding through the federal government, and then was able to post for the opportunity, and it was about a quarter to be funded by the local participants. So I think, and that was roughly $100,000 funded by the local partners that I listed in the presentation. So the bulk, about the other 3/4 of it was funded by, I believe it was NRCan and FCM.
I encourage anybody in the audience to also enter your questions in the Q&A if you have any. And if I don't see any, I would like to invite the panelists to ask questions of each other or to expand on something in your presentation that you would like to expand on.
I put a couple of things in the chat, and hopefully those might prove useful, including the link to the Oak Ridges Marine Groundwater Program,
Great, thank you.
just to show some of the things that that group has accomplished.
Okay, well, maybe it's time to wrap up then, 5 minutes early. I wanted to say a big thank you to Dawn and Kendra and Kris for joining us today. I really appreciated your presentations and I learned a lot from you. And I hope the audience enjoyed them. And with that, I will say, see you next week to those that will be attending our webinar next week. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on here.